The galaxy was on fire. Not metaphor, not poetry, actual fire columns of black smoke rising from a battlefield so vast it had its own weather system curling upward into a sky crowded with warships that moved like slow silver predators through the haze. Pull back further. Hundreds of them. An empire's worth of firepower arranged in formations that looked from high enough like certainty itself. Closer now. One fortress, one war chamber, one holographic map glowing blue and confident in the dark, displaying a war that everyone inside believed they understood. Closer still. A man, standing alone in the center of the room. No weapons, no armor, a worn field jacket, a battered notebook. 20 soldiers forming a circle around him with their hands near their blades. He is not afraid. That is the first strange thing. The second strange thing, he is smiling. And the most powerful woman in the empire is staring at him like she cannot decide whether he is the most dangerous person she has ever met, or the only honest one. The war chamber smelled like burnt metal and old decisions. Kalen Rowe noticed that first. Not the weapons, not the 20 armed soldiers forming a loose circle around him. Not even the holographic star maps drifting overhead like the galaxy had decided to redecorate. The smell. Burnt metal. And something older underneath it. Something that reminded him of filing cabinets and ignored reports, and the particular silence of a comm line going dead at 3 in the morning when you're still at your desk and you already know what it means. He knew that smell well. He stood in the center of the circular floor and did not move, did not fidget, did not scan the room the way people scan rooms when they're looking for exits. Because he wasn't looking for an exit. He'd spent 4 months planning to get into this room. He wasn't leaving until he was ready. The soldiers were Alaran, dark battle armor, narrow seams of pale light running along the joints, pulsing slowly like the suits themselves were breathing. 20 of them arranged in a formation that somebody had clearly designed to be intimidating. It was working technically. Kalen just didn't have the bandwidth for intimidation right now. He tilted his head slightly and looked up at the star maps. Outdated, 3 sectors off. The positioning data was running on information that was at minimum 30 hours stale, probably closer to 40. He could tell by the fleet symbols clustered near the Drevith corridor. Nobody who actually knew where those ships were right now would display them there, which meant the people in this room didn't know, which meant he was unfortunately still necessary. Good. He lowered his gaze. And that was when he saw her. Commander Varen Sorrel stood at the far edge of the chamber, several steps removed from the semicircle of officers flanking her. She was not moving. She was not speaking. She was simply watching him with an expression that Kalen categorized after a moment's consideration as controlled assessment. Not anger, not contempt. Assessment. Like she was reading a document and hadn't decided yet what it meant. She was tall by human standards, taller than most of the armored soldiers around her. Her skin held that particular Ilaran luminescence. Not quite glow, not quite shimmer, something in between, like pale stone lit from within. Her hair was silver white, pulled back with a precision that suggested habit rather than vanity. Her eyes were violet, not the soft violet of old earth paintings, the sharp reflective violet of something that caught light and held it and considered carefully before giving anything back. She wore full commander's armor, dark like the others. But the seam light on hers ran in patterns slightly different from the rest. Rank markings, probably, or something older than rank. She was, Callan thought, exactly what the reports had described. And the reports had described quite a lot. One of the officers stepped forward. Male. Senior rank from the positioning. He had the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades being right about things and resented any evidence to the contrary. You were found in the wreckage of 2 armored carriers, he said, in Alaran. The translation ship behind Kalen's ear processed it in less than a second. Both destroyed. You were the only living thing within 300 meters. Kalen nodded. Weird afternoon. The officer stared at him. You find this amusing. I find it accurate. Another officer younger shifted his weight. He mocks us. A third replied, barely audible. Or he doesn't understand the situation. Callan pointed at the third one without looking away from the senior officer. I understand the situation. He let that land. I just don't think the situation is as complicated as you're making it. The senior officer's jaw tightened. You disabled two Imperial carriers. I didn't disable anything. The wreckage. The carriers drove over an unstable munitions cache. Callan said it the way you'd explain something to someone who'd asked the same question twice. Not unkind, just clear. The explosion was the cache's idea. I was in the vicinity. Silence, then. You were in the vicinity. Technically, I was standing about 40 meters uphill. I know it looked dramatic. The officer turned toward Commander Sorrell with the expression of a man who needed permission to be as offended as he felt. She didn't give it. Her gaze hadn't moved from Callan. You are not registered military, she said. First time she'd spoken. Her voice was quieter than he'd expected. Deliberate. The kind of quiet that doesn't need volume to fill a room. Correct. Not mercenary guild. No. Not affiliated with any rival coalition. Callan almost smiled. If I was, I'd have better equipment. He gestured at himself. Worn field jacket. Practical boots with one scuffed toe. A handful of small tools clipped to his belt. A battered data stylus in his left breast pocket. No weapons, no armor, nothing that read as threat unless you knew what you were looking at. Which nobody in this room did yet. You are a salvage technician, Sorrell said. Recovery specialist. He considered. Salvage technician is fine, actually. A younger soldier near the wall muttered something. The chip translated it as, this human is broken somehow. Callan appreciated the honesty. Sorrell took one step forward. Just one. But the room changed when she moved. The officers adjusted without realizing they were adjusting. The circle tightened slightly. The temperature of the air, metaphorically, probably literally dropped a degree. She stopped at what Callan estimated was exactly the distance a trained commander maintains when she wants information, but hasn't decided if she trusts the source. Explain your presence on an active battlefield, she said. I was recovering materials from the previous engagement. He tilted his head toward the distant windows. Outside, beyond the fortress walls, the sky was still thick with low-hanging smoke from the morning's fighting. There was a significant amount of salvageable tech in Sector 9. Guidance systems. Partially intact power cores. Good equipment doesn't stop being useful just because somebody shot it. You entered a war zone for scrap metal. Valuable scrap metal. Another officer made a sound that might have been a laugh and wasn't. Sorrell's expression didn't change. But something in her eyes did. A small recalibration. Like she'd expected one kind of answer and received a slightly different one, and was now adjusting her model accordingly. How did you disable the carriers? She said. Not a question. A return to a point she hadn't accepted. I told you I didn't. The first carrier detonated an underground munitions cache, she said. The cache was not on any active survey map. Our engineers did not flag it during battlefield assessment. It was old, Callan said. Pre-conflict installation, maybe 60 years. The casing had degraded, but the payload was still viable. Easy to miss if you're scanning for recent hardware. And you found it. I scanned for old hardware too. A beat of silence. The second carrier, she continued. Chain reaction from the first detonation. The shockwave destabilized a fuel conduit on the second carrier's undercarriage. Took about 90 seconds. I was already moving uphill when it went. You anticipated the chain reaction. Callan paused. 1 second. 2. I modeled it, yes. The room went very still. Not the previous kind of still. This was a different texture. This was the stillness of 20 soldiers all arriving at the same thought at the same moment, and none of them liking it. You modeled it, the senior officer repeated slowly. Basic physics. Carrier weight plus fuel load plus shockwave radius plus a 60-year-old munitions cache with degraded casing equals... Callan made a small gesture with one hand. You can do the math. That is not basic physics. The officer's voice had dropped. That is battlefield intelligence. I'm good at observation. That is not enough. Sorrell's voice was quiet. The room obeyed it immediately and completely. She looked at Callan for a long moment. You observe, you calculate. You position yourself in a specific location to be captured by our forces rather than running. She paused. You are not here for salvage. Kalen met her eyes. No, he said. Not primarily. Then why are you here? And here it was, the question. The one he'd walked across 40 meters of contested terrain in one unstable munitions cache and two exploding armored carriers to be asked. He said, I needed to speak with you. The reaction was less explosive than he'd anticipated. He'd expected outrage. He got something quieter and more dangerous. The particular stillness of a room where everyone is waiting for the floor to drop. Sorrel studied him. With me specifically. Yes. You are a civilian salvage technician from... She glanced at one of the officers, who supplied a sector designation Kellen didn't recognize as home. Close enough. From the outer systems, you have no military standing, no diplomatic credentials, no known affiliation. All accurate. And you required to speak with the commander of the Alaran First Wing specifically. Not any officer, not any diplomatic channel. Tried the diplomatic channels, Kalen said. Didn't work out. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not quite recognition. The beginning of a question she hadn't yet decided to ask. So you walked into a battlefield. It was the most direct route. One of the younger officers pressed his fingertips to his forehead in what the translation chip flagged as a gesture of exasperated disbelief. Kalen found that oddly comforting. Sorrel moved again, slowly. Not toward him sideways, a single step, the beginning of a circling motion. The movement of someone who thinks better when they're not stationary. What do you want from me, human? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Kalen didn't rush the answer. He let the silence do a little work first. Then he said, you. 3 seconds. 3. 3 full seconds where nothing in the room moved except the slow drift of the holographic star maps overhead. Then it broke. Insolent, Commander, allow me to. This is an insult to remove him. Voices overlapping, officers stepping forward, the circle tightening. 3 soldiers had hands near their sidearms, not drawing but near. Kalen raised both hands, open palms, universal gesture. He knew it was universal because he checked. Before anyone starts making permanent decisions, he said, keeping his voice level. I should clarify something. No one was listening, except one person. Sorrel hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. The chaos around her had simply failed to reach her the way weather fails to reach the inside of a well-constructed building. Her eyes stayed on Kalen. He stayed on her. Something passed between them that wasn't words. An acknowledgement, maybe. That this was the part where things either escalated beyond repair or they didn't, and exactly one person in this room got to decide which. Enough. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room dropped silent with the particular speed of 20 people who had learned through repetition that this woman's quiet was worth more attention than most people's shouting. She turned to the senior officer. Leave us. The officer blinked. Commander, you and the unit, wait outside the primary corridor. Protocol dictates that a prisoner... I'm adjusting protocol. She said it without inflection. Then her gaze moved to a different officer. Leave us, Sene. A different man stepped forward from the near edge of the group, younger than the senior officer, leaner, with the careful eyes of someone who cataloged everything and forgot nothing. This one Callan hadn't clocked initially. He'd been quiet, still, the kind of still that was different from the others. Not intimidation, observation. Senetel, had to be. The name had appeared 3 times in the background research. Tal, first captain of the Sorrel Command Unit, described in 2 independent sources as the person who actually made the unit function. Tal looked at Kalen with an expression that communicated with remarkable efficiency several things simultaneously. I don't trust you. I don't trust your story. I will be directly outside that door. And if anything happens to her, we will have a different kind of conversation. Callan gave him a small nod. Tael's eyes narrowed slightly. Then he turned and the unit followed him out. 20 soldiers moving in organized silence. The door sealed behind them. And then there were 2. Sorrel stood in the center of the chamber. The star maps drifted overhead, casting shifting blue light across the angles of her armor. Callan stood opposite her with his hands still slightly raised, then slowly lowered them when it became clear she wasn't going to react to the gesture either way. Clarify, she said. Which part? The part where you walked onto a battlefield, allowed yourself to be captured, and told the commander of the Alaran First Wing that what you want is her. A pause. Start wherever seems relevant. Kalen lowered his hands the rest of the way. You asked what I wanted, he said. I answered honestly. You answered provocatively. Sometimes those are the same thing. She didn't respond to that. She was watching him with that same quality of attention. Total. The kind that felt less like being looked at and more like being carefully read. You are not what you presented yourself as, she said. I am a recovery specialist. That part's accurate. But not entirely. Callan was quiet for a moment. I used to do something else, he said, before the salvage work. What? Data analysis for a civilian intelligence contractor, outer systems treaty monitoring. He paused. I was good at it. Why did you stop? The question was simple. The answer was not. Callan filed it away for later and said, the work changed. She accepted that, or set it aside. You claimed you attempted to communicate through official channels 3 times and failed. The first attempt was declined in 48 hours, standard rejection, insufficient supporting documentation. He said it the way you repeat a thing you've repeated many times before without heat, just the shape of it. The second attempt I came back with more documentation, better documentation, a full sector analysis with source data points. That attempt was archived without review. I confirmed this 6 weeks later through a secondary contact. Sorrell's eyes hadn't moved from his face. The third attempt, she said. Callan was quiet for a moment. I had a contact inside the verification office, someone I'd worked with before. She agreed to carry the report directly to an officer with clearance to escalate. He paused. 6 hours after I transmitted the report to her, she stopped responding. I spent the next 2 days trying to reach her through backup channels. Another pause. I eventually confirmed she'd been transferred. Emergency reassignment. She's currently in a monitoring post in the outer ring. No communication access. The star maps drifted. 6 hours, Sorrell said. 6 hours. She turned slightly, not away from him, to the side, looking at the star maps without quite looking at them. You believe someone suppressed the reports? I don't believe it. I have the access logs from the first 2 attempts. I have the timestamp on my contact's transfer order. He said it without drama. The suppression is documented. I'm just the only one who's seen the documents. She turned back. Why come to me? And here was the real question. The one underneath all the others. The one he'd spent longer considering than the rest of it combined. Callan looked at her steadily. Because you're the only person in this empire who's on record doing what I'm asking you to do. She waited. The Vorith crossing, he said. The air in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a gasp or a sharp movement or the theatrical freeze of a badly written story. It was subtler than that. The particular quality of attention Sorrell had been giving him, precise, controlled, careful, sharpened into something different, like a lens adjusting focus. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. That record, she said finally, is sealed. Yes, it is not accessible through any public registry, any civilian contractor database, any outer systems intelligence network. Her voice was very calm. The only people who know the details of what happened at Vorith Crossing are the officers who were present and the members of the High Command Review Board. And me, Callan said. And you. He waited. How, she said. Salvage work. She studied him. That is not an answer, she said. It is, actually. He shifted his weight slightly. Not nervousness, adjustment. I've been doing recovery work in active and post-conflict zones for 6 years. You find things in the wreckage of battles. Not just hardware, data cores, personal logs, encoded field reports that weren't encrypted properly because whoever wrote them was under fire and not thinking about information security. She was very still. 3 years ago, I was working a post-conflict site in the Vorath sector. Old battle, long cleared by the time I got there. I found a data core in the wreckage of a command vehicle. Wasn't valuable for salvage, but it was intact. He paused. I read what was on it. What was on it? A field commander's unredacted log of the Vorath engagement. He said it quietly. Including the order you refused to carry out. Including the reason you refused. Including what would have happened to 2,000 Ilaran soldiers in the Eastern Corridor if you had carried it out. A beat. The field commander who wrote that log believed you saved those soldiers. He wasn't pleased about it. He documented it in detail because he planned to submit a formal complaint to the High Command Review Board. Sorrell's expression had not changed. Not precisely, but something behind it had. He submitted the complaint, she said. Yes, and the review board sealed the entire record, both the complaint and the field data supporting your decision. Kalen paused. I don't know exactly why they sealed it, but I have theories. What are your theories? That the order you refused was itself irregular, that reviewing the incident properly would have required investigating who issued that order and why. He met her eyes, and that somebody with sufficient rank didn't want that investigation to happen. Silence. Long. The star maps drifted. The chamber's ventilation system made a sound like distant wind. Outside, somewhere in the fortress, Kalen could hear the low vibration of large engines doing something he couldn't identify from this distance. Sorrel held his gaze. You came here, she said, because of that. Partly. He paused. I came here because I have information this empire needs and 3 failed attempts at delivering it through proper channels. I came here because someone inside this command structure is actively suppressing that information. He paused again. And I came here because the one person in this empire who has demonstrated on record that she will not carry out a wrong order even under direct pressure from her superiors. He let that breathe for a moment, is you. Sorrell was quiet for a long time. Then, what do you want from me, human? And this time it wasn't the same question. Same words, completely different weight. She was asking something real now underneath the surface of it. She was asking, what are you actually here for? What do you actually need? Callan said, I want you to listen. The answer landed differently than his first one. No explosion, no reaction from the emptied room. Just the two of them, in the drifting star maps, in the sound of distant engines. Sorrell studied him for a long moment. Then she walked to the command table at the center of the room, pressed 2 fingers to the surface. The holographic display above them reconfigured, pulling the star map lower, spreading it between them like a shared surface, across which someone was about to have a real conversation. She looked at him from the other side of it. Then talk, she said. And Kalen Rowe, who had spent 4 months planning to get into this room, who had crossed a battlefield on foot and stood in front of 20 armed soldiers without flinching, who had carried a piece of information through 3 failed attempts, and one desperate fourth, reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the small battered notebook, and opened it to the first page. On that page, in handwriting that was cramped and precise and covered nearly every available centimeter of the paper, was a diagram of 3 fleet formations, and the space they were moving to occupy. Sorrell looked at the page, then at him. How long have you had this? She said. 8 weeks, Callan said. Give or take. 8 weeks, 3 of which I spent trying to get someone in this empire to look at it. He set the notebook on the edge of the command table. Not toward her, just available. The other 5 I was working on getting here. She looked at the diagram again. He watched her read it, watched the moment she started to understand what she was looking at. The particular quality of stillness that settles over someone who has just recognized the shape of a problem they didn't know they had. This, she said slowly, is not a current engagement map. No. These positions, if accurate, would indicate a comprehensive encirclement strategy targeting the entire Dreveth front, Callan said. Yes? She looked up. Your current engagement data puts the Drevath coalition forces here. He touched a point on the holographic map. And here. 3 points. well inside a Lauren-controlled space. But that's based on positioning data that's at least 30 hours old. Our intelligence is updated every 12 hours through the standard verification circuit, Callan said. I know, but if the reports coming in through that circuit are being altered before they reach this display, he gestured at the map above them, then the update frequency doesn't matter. She held his gaze. The actual positions, he said, are different. He touched 3 different points on the map. The holographic system was voice-locked to Alaran command codes, so he couldn't update it himself. He was pointing at air, but the points were specific, precise, not estimates. How precise are those coordinates? She said. Within a standard tactical radius. He met her eyes. Precise enough. She was quiet. He let her be quiet. Outside the sealed door, the Empire was running on a map that lied. Somewhere in the command structure, someone was making sure it kept lying. And 6 days from now, give or take the margin of error in his calculations, the encirclement would be complete. Unless someone in this room decided to do something about it. Sorrel looked at the notebook on the edge of the table, at the diagram, at the 3 points in the air where Kalen's finger had rested. Then she looked at him with those violet eyes that caught light and gave it back only when they chose to. Captain Tyle, she said, not loudly. The door must have been monitored, because within 4 seconds it opened, and Tale was in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been standing directly on the other side of it this entire time, not that he'd admit it. Commander, I need an independent verification run on current coalition fleet positioning. Do not route it through the standard circuit. She paused. Use the secondary array. Run it yourself. Tyle looked at Kalen. Kalen gave him nothing. Tyle looked back at Sorrel. And the prisoner. He stays, she said. For now. Tyle absorbed this with the professionalism of a man who has learned that his commander's decisions sometimes don't come with explanations attached, and that demanding explanations is not part of his function. Understood, he said, and left. Something in the room shifted with his departure. Not warmth exactly, something more complicated than that. The specific quality of a situation that has moved from its original shape into something nobody in it has a name for yet. Sorrel looked at Kalen. You will remain here while the verification runs, she said. Fine by me. If the data contradicts your claims, it won't. She tilted her head slightly. You are certain. Callan thought about 8 weeks of work, about 3 failed attempts, about a comm line going dead 6 hours after he'd made his 3rd try, about a name on a transfer order, about a data core he'd found in the rubble of an old battle, and a field commander's voice preserved in degrading digital amber, describing the moment a young Alaran officer had looked at a wrong order and simply said no. I'm certain, he said. Sorrel studied him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the star map. And Kalen Rowe sat down on the edge of the command table, not the chair, there wasn't one he made do, and opened his notebook to the 2nd page. Because the diagram on the 1st page was just the beginning. And they had a war to stop. The verification took 40 minutes. Kalen counted them. Not because he was nervous, because he was calculating how much the number would matter when Tell came back. 40 minutes meant Tell had run the secondary array twice, cross-referenced, then ran it a 3rd time because the results didn't match what he expected, which meant the results were exactly what Callan had said they would be. The door opened. Tayel walked in. He did not look at Callan immediately. He looked at Sorrel, and in the 3 seconds between entering the room and speaking, his expression did something complicated and controlled and ultimately unsuccessful at being neutral. The secondary array confirms, he said. Coalition fleet positioning does not match current operational display. Sorrel did not react visibly. Kalen did not say anything. Tayel set a data slate on the command table. 3 formations have repositioned in the last 31 hours. The deviation is significant. He paused. The encirclement model the human described is consistent with confirmed positioning. Silence. Then Sorrel said, how long has the primary display been running on the incorrect data? Tayel looked at his slate, then looked up. Based on the timestamp divergence between the standard circuit feed and the secondary array. Another pause shorter, this time the pause of a man who has already done the math and doesn't like the answer at minimum 72 hours. 3 days. The operational map had been lying for 3 days. Sorrel turned to look at the holographic display above the command table, at the fleet symbols sitting placidly in their incorrect positions, at the neat, confident picture of a war that was not actually where the map said it was. The standard circuit, she said. Who has authorization to alter incoming feeds before they reach the operational display? Tyle was quiet for a moment. Just a moment. At this command level, he said, the authorization chain runs through 3 verification officers and 1 senior command approval. He stopped. The senior command approval at this installation is currently General Marin Dovek. The name settled into the room like cold water finding its level. Kalen said nothing. He had been saying nothing for several minutes and he planned to continue. This part was not his. Sorrel looked at the star map for a long time. Then she turned back to Kalen. You knew about the circuit manipulations, she said. I suspected it. I couldn't confirm it from outside. He met her eyes. I needed someone inside to run the verification. You used us to confirm your theory. I used you to confirm a fact that affects your survival. He said it without apology. There's a difference. Tyle looked at him with an expression that said clearly that Tyle was aware there was a difference and was also aware that the distinction was doing a lot of work in that sentence. But he didn't contradict it, because the data on his slate was real, and real data has a way of reorganizing arguments. Sorrel walked slowly to the far side of the command table. She placed both hands flat on the surface, looked down at the notebook Kalen had left there still open to the diagram on the first page. Walk me through it, she said. Kalen stood, picked up the notebook. The Dravath Coalition has been running what looks like a conventional attritional campaign for the last 4 months, he said. Pressure on the forward positions, targeted strikes on supply infrastructure, enough engagement to keep the first wing committed to the Drevith front. He paused. But they're not trying to win those engagements. Tyle frowned. They've taken significant losses. Acceptable losses. Kalen moved to the edge of the holographic display. He pointed at a corridor of space to the eastern edge of the map. Every major coalition engagement in the last 8 weeks has been here. Or here. Or here. 3 points. All of them on the same side of the Drevith front. Tyle looked at the points, then looked at the space on the other side. They've left the western approach almost entirely uncontested, he said slowly, because they don't need to contest it. Kalen shifted his attention to the western quadrant. They're not coming through the front. They've been routing 3 heavy fleet formations through the outer corridor. Here, here, and here. The positions he'd already identified, the ones Tyle had just confirmed. In approximately 6 days, those formations complete the encirclement. The entire Drevith front is isolated. No resupply, no reinforcement corridor, no extraction route. Tyle stared at the map. Sorrel stared at the map. Kalen had stared at this map, or versions of it, for 8 weeks. He was past the staring stage. He was in the stage of watching other people arrive at the conclusion he'd been sitting with for 2 months. It was not a comfortable thing to watch, but it was necessary. They're not fighting the Empire, Sorrel said quietly. No. They're surrounding it. Yes. A long silence. Then Tyle, almost under his breath. 6 days. Give or take the margin on my positioning data, Kalen said. It could be 5, it could be 7, but the window is closing. He looked at Sorrel. That's why I'm here now. Not 3 weeks ago, not next week. Now. Sorrel straightened. If the encirclement completes, the Drevith front collapses, the first wing is cut off from the core systems, and the Drevith coalition doesn't stop there. He paused. They've been building capacity for a sustained campaign beyond the Alaran border. This isn't a territorial dispute. It's an opening move. The room was very quiet. Outside the sealed windows, the sky above the planet was crowded with Alaran ships. The same ships that had been responding to 4 months of engagement operations and had no idea they were being slowly surrounded by a force that had learned from prior experience exactly how long it took for the right people to stop paying attention. You said Sorrel began then stopped. Started again. You said you attempted to report this 3 times. Yes? Through what channels? First attempt, standard, outer systems, civilian intelligence submission. Addressed to the Alaran Treaty Monitoring Division. I had sourced documentation. He turned a page in the notebook. Declined in 48 hours. Insufficient direct evidence. Sorrel glanced at Tyel. Something passed between them that Kalen couldn't fully read. Second attempt, he continued. I refined the analysis, added 6 weeks of additional positioning data, submitted through the same division with a request for senior officer review. He paused. The submission was archived without review. I confirmed this when I contacted the division office directly through a secondary channel approximately 5 weeks later. Who archived it? Tell said. The archive log listed a verification officer named Preth Vaughn, assigned to Dovek's oversight circuit. Tyel wrote something on his slate, quickly, without being asked. Callan noted that. Third attempt, he said. He turned another page. He looked at the page for a moment before continuing. I had a contact inside the verification office, someone I'd worked with during my time in civilian intelligence analysis. She had clearance sufficient to route the report directly to a field officer. She agreed to carry it. He stopped. 6 hours after I transmitted the report, he said she stopped responding. I spent 48 hours attempting to reach her through backup contacts. He looked up. She had been transferred. Emergency reassignment order. She's currently stationed at a monitoring post in the outer ring. Communication restricted. The room was very still. The transfer order, Sorrel said. Do you have documentation? Partial. I have the timestamp of my transmission to her. I have a confirmation of receipt from her personal device. I have the timestamp on the public record of her reassignment. He paused. I don't have the transfer order itself. That's internal command documentation. I couldn't access it from outside. Sorrel held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Tyel. Tyel looked back at Sorrel. This was the kind of exchange that carries an entire conversation without words. The kind that only happens between two people who have worked together long enough that language has become optional for certain categories of understanding. Tyel turned toward the door. I'll pull the transfer authorization records, he said, through the secondary system. Don't route it through. I know, he said, and left. Sorrel sat down on the edge of the command table, not in a chair. On the edge of the table itself in a movement so uncommander-like that it caught Callan slightly off guard. Like watching someone very formal suddenly put down something heavy they'd been carrying for a long time. She looked at him. You lost someone, she said. Callan looked at the notebook in his hands. A contact, he said. That is not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. And here it was, the thing underneath the briefing, the thing that lived in the handwriting in that notebook, cramped and precise, covering every available millimeter of every page. The way you write when you cannot afford to stop, because stopping means sitting with what you already know. I worked in outer systems treaty monitoring for 9 years, he said. That's a long time to work alongside the same people. He paused. When you work in that kind of environment, you learn very quickly who can be trusted to carry important information carefully. Another pause. She was one of maybe 3 people I would have trusted with that. Sorrel waited. Her name was Dara, he said. She'd been in the verification office for 11 years. She knew every protocol, every shortcut, every place where the system was slower than it should be, and every place where it moved fast when someone with the right rank pushed it. He stopped. She was also the kind of person who brought extra food to work because there was always someone in the office who forgot to eat. He looked at the notebook. When I got confirmation of her transfer, I tried to reach her directly. Personal device, multiple times. Eventually, a response came through. He paused. 2 sentences. She said she was fine. She said she couldn't talk. He closed the notebook. That was 4 weeks ago. Sorrel was quiet. She is still alive, she said. It wasn't quite a question. As far as I know. He looked up. But she can't carry anything for me anymore. And she lost 11 years of work because I asked her to help. He said it simply, without drama, just the shape of it. That's the 3rd attempt. Sorrel looked at him for a long moment. You blame yourself, she said. I made the calculation wrong, he said. I thought the transfer would take longer. I thought she'd have time to route the report before anyone could stop it. He paused. I was wrong. A silence settled between them that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting with a weight that one of them has been carrying alone for a long time, and the other has just agreed to acknowledge. Then Sorrel said quietly, "Why this war?" Kellen looked at her. Of all the things a former civilian analyst turned salvage technician might invest 8 weeks of his life in, she continued, why this conflict? Why this encirclement? He was quiet. You know about a planet called Ishara, he said. She went still, not the controlled stillness of a commander managing a conversation. Something older and involuntary. That is in the outer territories, she said carefully. Yes. He met her eyes. About 4 years ago, small population center, agricultural settlement mostly, not strategically significant, not militarily relevant. He paused. The Drevath Coalition's predecessor organization had been running pressure operations in that sector. Low intensity, the kind of thing that generates reports and gets archived and never reaches anyone with the authority to do something about it. Sorrel's expression had not changed, but she was very still. I was still working in treaty monitoring at the time, Kalen said. I had filed 2 reports on escalating activity in the Ashara sector, flagged it as a potential civilian safety issue. Both reports were reviewed and classified as low priority. He paused. 6 weeks after the second report, the settlement was destroyed. The words sat in the room. Destroyed, plain and complete, and requiring nothing added to it. 840 people, he said. Permanent residents. Another 200 and some transient workers who happened to be there for the harvest season. Sorrel said nothing. I did not know anyone there personally, Kalen said. That's not what this is. He stopped. I knew the reports. I knew the numbers. I knew what the escalation pattern looked like, and I knew where it was going, and I filed 2 reports, and both of them were archived as low priority. He looked at his hands. And then one morning I came into work and there was a casualty summary on my desk, and I sat there looking at it for a very long time. He opened the notebook again, not to show her anything, just to have something to look at. I left the monitoring office 8 months later, he said. Started doing recovery work. It was different, tangible. You go somewhere, you find something, you bring it back. The result is visible. Either you recovered it or you didn't. He paused. After 9 years of filing reports that disappeared into archive systems that felt important, he looked up. But the problem with recovery work in post-conflict zones, he said, is that you see a lot of conflict zones, and after a while you start to notice patterns. And once you've seen the pattern, he paused, you can't unfind it. Sorrel looked at him for a long time. The Drevath Coalition, she said, successor organization to the same group that operated in Ashara. He said it clearly. Different name, significantly expanded capacity, the same strategic approach. Low-intensity pressure operations, systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure reports filed and archived until it's too late. He paused. The scale is different now, but the pattern is the same. Sorrel stood. She walked to the window. Outside, the ships were still there. Her ships. The same ships that had been fighting a war they thought they understood. The war that was actually a waiting trap. You came here, she said to the window, because of Ashara. I came here because the same pattern that destroyed Ashara is being run again at a much larger scale, he said. And because 3 attempts to report it through proper channels resulted in 2 archive submissions, and 1 person transferred to a communication-restricted posting in the outer ring. He paused. And because the proper channels in this command structure appear to run through a man who is actively ensuring this information doesn't reach anyone who can act on it. She turned. You are describing General Tovek, she said. By implication. I'm describing whoever signed those archive orders and that transfer authorization. He met her eyes. I don't have his name on those documents yet, but the circuit runs through him. Tael will find it. She looked at him steadily. And if Tael finds it, she said, and the documentation shows what you believe it shows, then you have a problem inside your command structure That is more immediate than the encirclement, Kalen said, because someone has been feeding your operational display false positioning data for at least 72 hours, and that someone has sufficient rank to move a verification office employee on very short notice. He paused. That's not a low-level operation. The door opened. Tael walked in. He looked at Sorrel first, then at Kalen. His expression had changed during the time he'd been gone. The careful professional neutrality had developed a crack in it. Not wide, but visible if you knew where to look. He set a data slate on the command table. The transfer authorization for verification officer Dara Meln, he said. Time-stamped 4 weeks ago. He paused. Signed by General Marin Dovek. Nobody moved, the name on the transfer order. Dovek. Callan looked at the slate. He did not reach for it. He didn't need to. He'd been building toward this document for 4 weeks, and now it existed in the room, and the information it contained was no longer something only he knew, which meant it was real in a different way now. Sorrel looked at the slate for a long moment. Then she looked at Tile. The archive orders, she said, for the 2 civilian intelligence submissions. Still pulling, Tile said. The archive logs from the Treaty Monitoring Division are in a different system. It will take... He checked something on his wrist device. Another 20 minutes to access them through the secondary array. Pull them. Yes, Commander. He turned to go. Senna. Her voice quiet. He stopped. Does Dovek know you've been running the secondary array? Tail turned back. Something in his face had gone very still. Not unless he's monitoring it directly, he said. The secondary array doesn't log to the primary circuit. Keep it that way. Understood. He left. Sorrel picked up the data slate, read it. Callan watched her read it and thought about what it looked like to watch someone confirm something they'd already suspected but hoped they were wrong about. It looked like this. Very still, very controlled. The kind of face that has spent years learning not to show what it costs to remain composed. She set the slate down. When you came here, she said, you already knew the transfer order existed. I knew it existed. I didn't have his name on it. But you suspected. I suspected the suppression ran to someone with sufficient seniority to act immediately and quietly. He paused. Dovek has the rank. He has the circuit access. And he had the motive. If the encirclement plan succeeds, the coalition benefits from having had an Ilaran general working from the inside. He paused again. I didn't bring you that name as an accusation. I brought you the pattern. The documentation is what turned the pattern into a name. Sorrel considered him. You are very careful, she said, about what you claim versus what you document. Spent 9 years in treaty monitoring, he said. Claims get archived. Documentation gets reviewed. Something happened in her expression, not quite a smile, the shape of something that had considered one. Then the door opened again. But it wasn't Tile. General Marin Dovek walked into the command chamber with the particular authority of a man who has never in his professional life entered a room and doubted whether he belonged there. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the Ilaran way, which meant slightly more than the human equivalent. His armor was more elaborate than Sorrel's. More rank markings, more ornamentation, the visual vocabulary of a man who had spent a career accumulating the visible signs of his own importance. He looked at Callan first, then at Sorrel, then at the data slate on the table. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, controlled, gone before it properly appeared. Commander Sorrel, he said, I was informed you had taken a prisoner into unsecured interrogation without standard unit presence. I adjusted protocol, Sorrel said. Exactly as she'd said it to the officer earlier. The same words, the same tone. The interrogation required a different approach. The interrogation of a civilian salvage worker. Dovek looked at Callan with the look of a man who has categorized something and found the category unsatisfactory. Is he a threat? He has information. What information? Sorrel paused. 1 second. 2. And in that pause, Callan watched her make a decision. He couldn't have said exactly what it looked like from the outside, but he recognized it. He'd spent enough time watching people at the moment they decided how much to trust what was in front of them. Fleet positioning data, she said. We're running a verification. Through what circuit? Secondary array. Something in Dovek's posture adjusted. A very small adjustment. The kind a man makes when something has surprised him and he doesn't want it to show. The secondary array is typically reserved for technical calibration, he said. It's useful for independent verification, Sorrell said. When there are questions about the primary feed. A silence. Not long, but textured. Questions, Dovek said. Discrepancies, Sorrell said, between the primary display and the secondary array readout. Dovek looked at the holographic star map, at the fleet symbols in their comfortable incorrect positions. Then he looked at Callan. Callan looked back at him. He kept his face neutral. Pleasant even. The face of a man who is comfortable with silences and has nowhere he particularly needs to be. Dovek looked back at Sorrell. This man should be returned to detention, he said. Whatever he's told you, he's a civilian with no verified credentials and no official standing. The risk of disinformation is exactly why I'm running the verification, Sorrell said. Another silence. Dovek glanced at the data slate on the table, just for a moment, then back at Sorrell. I'll send 2 officers to collect him, he said. While the verification completes, he should be in a secured location. He stays here, Sorrell said. Commander, he stays here, she said again, still quiet, still controlled. I haven't finished with him. Dovek looked at her. The kind of look that carries a message, that says be careful, that says you are moving in a direction you should reconsider, that says I have more authority in this command structure than you, and we both know what that means. Sorrell looked back, and her face said nothing. Nothing at all, which was itself an answer. Dovek turned without further comment and left the room. The door sealed behind him. In the silence that followed, Callan became aware that he had been holding his breath for approximately the last 30 seconds. He let it out slowly without making it obvious. Sorrell stood exactly where she'd been standing. She had not moved during the entire exchange. He looked at the slate, Callan said. Yes? He knows you have the transfer order. Probably. He's going to move quickly now. Yes. She turned to look at him. How quickly? Callan thought about it. He doesn't know exactly what we have. He knows you ran a secondary array verification. He knows you have a document on that slate. He doesn't know Tail is currently pulling the archive logs. He paused. He'll want to know what you know before he acts, which gives us a window. Another pause. Not a large one. Sorrell nodded once. Then she walked to the command table and pulled up the holographic display again. The incorrect map. The comfortable lie. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached past Callan's notebook and pressed 2 fingers to the table surface. Display secondary array positioning overlay, she said. The map shifted. Fleet symbols moved. New positions emerged from the old ones. The real positions. The ones the primary feed had been hiding for 72 hours. The encirclement pattern was visible immediately. 3 formations, 2 on one side, 1 sweeping around the back. The shape of a trap that had been closing slowly while the people inside it looked at a map that told them everything was fine. Sorrell stood in front of it and looked at the shape of the trap and said nothing for a long time. Callan stood beside her and did not fill the silence. 6 days, she said finally. Approximately. If we move immediately, the western corridor is still open. 2 of the 3 formations haven't completed their repositioning. If you redirect the 2nd and 4th Fleet groups through the western approach in the next 8 hours, you break the encirclement before it closes. That requires pulling resources from the active front. Yes. Dovek commands the front allocation. Yes. She looked at the map. He looked at the map. If I move without his authorization, she said slowly, carefully, I am acting outside my command mandate. Yes. I've done that before, she said. Quiet, not boasting, just fact. I know, Callan said. That's why I'm here. She turned to look at him, and in the blue light of the corrected map in the room that smelled like burnt metal and old decisions with 6 days on the clock and a general who had just seen enough to know he needed to act fast. She held his gaze for a long moment. "I need the archive logs," she said. As if on cue, the door opened. Tyel walked in. He set a second slate on the table. "Archive authorization records," he said. "Both submissions, both signed through the same verification officer under Dovek's circuit." He paused. "And both flagged with an override code that prevents them from appearing in the standard compliance audit." An override code, which meant this wasn't sloppiness, wasn't bureaucratic failure, wasn't the ordinary grinding inefficiency of a large military organization losing track of a civilian intelligence submission. It was deliberate, documented, and now in a room with the people who could read it. Sorrel picked up the second slate. "Read it," set it down. She looked at the map, at the shape of the trap, at the 6-day window, at the 2 data slates sitting on her command table with a general's authorization codes on them. Then she looked at Kalen. "You said," she began, stopped. "In the beginning, when I asked what you wanted." He waited. "You said you came here because I was the only one who might listen." "Yes." "Have I listened?" she asked. Callan looked at the corrected map, at the fleet symbols in their real positions, at the window that was still open but closing. "You're still asking questions," he said. "So yes." Something settled in her expression. Not resolution, not yet, but the shape of it. The beginning of the thing that comes before a decision that cannot be taken back. She looked at Tyel. "Close the room," she said. "I want full signal isolation. Nothing in or out of this chamber until I say otherwise." Tyel moved to the wall panel without question. She looked at the map one more time. 6 days. But the real clock Kalen knew was not the 6 days on the encirclement. The real clock had started the moment Dovek walked out of this room and looked at that slate. And that clock was measured in hours. The signal isolation sealed the room like a held breath. No transmissions in, no transmissions out. Just the 3 of them in the corrected map and 2 data slates that had just rewritten everything either Sorrel or Tyel had believed about the structure they operated inside. Sorrel stood at the command table. Tyel stood at the wall panel. Kalen sat on the edge of the table with his notebook and said nothing. Because this was not his moment. This was hers. And some moments need room to become what they are. She looked at the map for a long time. The encirclement pattern glowed in the blue light. 3 fleet formations, the western corridor still open. Barely. 6 days on the large clock. Hours on the real one. "If I move the 2nd and 4th fleet groups through the western approach," she said, "I need Dovek's authorization code to release the front allocation." Tyel said yes. "He won't give it." "No." "If I move without it, I am in direct violation of standing command protocol." "Yes." She looked at the map. "I've been in direct violation of standing command protocol before," she said. "Vorith Crossing," Tyel said. Quietly. Not a question. "Vorith Crossing." She paused. "That time it cost me 8 months of formal review and a sealed record." She paused again. "This time the scale is slightly different." Slightly. The word did a tremendous amount of work. Kalen looked at the map, at the shape of the trap, at the corridor that was still open but not for long. "There's another option," he said. Both of them looked at him. "You don't move without authorization," he said. "You remove the person blocking the authorization." Tyel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're describing a formal command challenge. I'm describing a documented insubordination case with evidence sufficient to trigger automatic review." Kalen opened the notebook to a page near the back, turned it so they could see it. Article 14 of the Alaran Military Code. If a senior officer is demonstrated to have altered operational intelligence in a manner that creates direct threat to command unit survival, any officer of sufficient rank may request emergency review and interim command suspension pending investigation. Silence. "I know the article," Sorrel said carefully. "The threshold for triggering it is documented evidence of intelligence alteration," Cullen said. "You have that. 2 archive override codes and a transfer authorization signed within hours of a report reaching the wrong person." He paused. "That's not a theory. That's a file." Tyel looked at Sorrel. He's right about the threshold. The review board convenes under Dovek's circuit, she said. Not for an Article 14, Callan said. Article 14 convenes under the Field Operations Emergency Panel. Different chain entirely. He doesn't sit on it. He can't block it. Another silence. Longer this time. Sorrel looked at him steadily. You know our military code, she said. I spent 9 years in treaty monitoring, he said. I read a lot of things I wasn't specifically assigned to read. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite amusement, something adjacent to it. The expression of a person recalibrating someone upward for the third or fourth time in a single afternoon. If I file Article 14, she said slowly, Dovek is suspended from command function pending review. His authorization codes are frozen during the suspension period. Command allocation reverts to the next senior officer in the field chain. Which is me, Sorrel said. Which is you, Kalen confirmed. Tyel turned back to the wall panel without being told. He pulled up a secondary interface. I can file it from here, he said. Through the emergency signal channel. It routes outside the primary circuit. How long does it take to process? Sorrel said. The suspension is automatic and immediate upon filing, Tyel said. The review board convenes within 24 hours. He paused. Dovek will be notified simultaneously. So the moment we file, he knows. Yes. Which meant the window between filing and his response was very small. And his response when it came would be the response of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had been thinking for some time about what to do if this moment arrived. Sorrel looked at Kalen. He'll challenge the filing, she said. Yes. He'll claim the evidence is insufficient or manufactured. Yes. The review board will need to assess the documentation before the suspension holds. Yes, Kalen paused. But the documentation is real, and the Field Operations Emergency Panel has direct access to the secondary array for independent verification. He met her eyes. He can challenge it all he wants. The data doesn't change. She was quiet. He waited. Because this was the part he couldn't do for her. He could bring the information. He could map the options. He could sit in a war chamber and explain military code to a commander who already knew it and just needed to hear it from outside the system that had been lying to her. But the decision, that was hers, always had been. File it, she said. Tyel's hands moved. It took 11 seconds, the soft acknowledgement tone from the emergency channel, a timestamp, a case reference number appearing in the corner of the secondary display. Somewhere in this fortress, General Marin Dovek received a notification. Somewhere in this fortress, his authorization codes went dark. The room did not shake. The lights did not change. The war outside did not pause for this moment. But something shifted the way things shift when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally specifically named. Tyel looked at the secondary display. Suspension confirmed. Command allocation reverted. He turned. You have the front. Sorrel nodded once. Then she looked at the star map, at the western corridor, at the fleet positions that needed to move. Open a line to the 2nd Fleet Group, she said. Open. And Varen Sorrel, commander of the Alaran First Wing, began giving orders. Not the orders she'd been given. Her own. Callan watched her work. Because watching someone be precisely and completely themselves at the exact moment it matters most is one of the rarest things you will ever see. And it deserves attention. She was efficient, direct, no unnecessary words. Each order calibrated to exactly the information the receiving officer needed and nothing more. She moved the 2nd Fleet Group first, routing them through the western corridor with a precision that suggested she'd already modeled this in her head before she ever picked up the comm. Then the 4th. Then 3 support formations to reinforce the repositioning. Then a targeted intercept order for the leading edge of the coalition's encirclement arm. The formation that was furthest along, the one that needed to be met before it could complete its arc. She gave that last order and closed the line, and the fortress around them began to vibrate with the low resonance of large engines changing course. Kalen let out a slow breath. She heard it. The timing, she said without turning. Is it sufficient? If they move now. He looked at the map, at the updated positions. at the math he'd been running for 8 weeks. Yes, the western corridor stays open for another 31 hours. The repositioning takes 18. You have a 13-hour margin. Tight. Yes. But sufficient. Yes. She turned from the map and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Not the commander's assessment, not the interrogator's precision. Something underneath both of those. Something that had been there the whole time and was only now standing in the light long enough to be recognized. The encirclement fails, she said. Yes. The coalition loses the strategic window. Yes. The front holds. Yes. He paused. For now. She tilted her head slightly. For now, she repeated. Stopping this encirclement doesn't end the pattern, he said. It ends this attempt. The coalition will regroup. They'll try again differently. And if the command structure still has vulnerabilities, he paused, then the next attempt finds them. She held his gaze. You are telling me this isn't finished. I'm telling you that stopping the immediate crisis doesn't fix the underlying problem. He met her eyes steadily. Dovek is one person, but he existed inside a system that let him operate for at least 72 hours before anyone ran a secondary array verification. He paused. That's the problem worth solving. She was quiet. Then, and you have thoughts on how to solve it? He held up the notebook. A few, he said. Something happened in her face. It was brief. It was real. It was the expression of someone who has spent a very long and difficult day carrying more than they were supposed to carry alone and has just encountered the unexpected presence of someone willing to help carry it. She looked away before it could settle into something she'd have to acknowledge out loud. We need to secure the documentation, she said, before Dovek's challenge reaches the review board. Tail has copies on the secondary system, Kellen said. I need them transmitted to the field operations emergency panel directly, not through any circuit Dovek has access to. The emergency channel, Tail said from the wall panel. It's still open. I can route the full file package now. Do it. Keys pressed. Transmission sent. Data moving through channels that a general with override codes could not touch. And then, a different sound. Not the soft acknowledgement of a filing confirmed. Something harder. A sharp alert from the primary circuit panel. Orange light. Tail looked at it. His jaw tightened slightly. Dovek has filed a counter-challenge. He's claiming the Article 14 submission is based on fabricated evidence and requesting emergency command reinstatement pending investigation. Can he get it, Callan said. He needs 2 senior officers to co-sign the reinstatement request, Tail said. He's currently reaching out to, he read from the panel, Sector Commander Varath and Field Marshal Andre. Sorrell's eyes sharpened. Varath will co-sign. Probably, Tail said. Andre is less certain. How long until the counter-challenge processes? If Varath co-signs immediately, 40 minutes, maybe less. 40 minutes. Kalen looked at the star map, at the fleet repositioning already underway, at the 18 hours of movement that now needed to complete before the Western Corridor closed. 40 minutes for the counter-challenge, 18 hours for the repositioning. If Dovek got his command codes back in 40 minutes, he could countermand the fleet orders before the repositioning completed. The file package, Kalen said. Has it reached the emergency panel yet? Tail checked. In transit, estimated arrival 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Sorrell said. If the panel reviews it before Varath co-signs, the panel reviews in sequence, Tail said. Counter-challenge first, then the original filing. He paused. Standard protocol. Of course it was. Standard protocol which existed to be fair and orderly, and which in this specific situation meant the man who had spent 72 hours falsifying operational intelligence would get his challenge heard before the evidence against him was reviewed. Kylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Who sits on the field operations emergency panel? Tyel listed 5 names. Kalen recognized 2 from the background research. 1 he did not know at all. 2 he knew by reputation. One of those he knew by more than reputation. Admiral Sora Vane, he said. Tyle stopped. Yes. She was the commanding officer on the Vorath engagement, Kellen said. He looked at Sorrel. She was in command when you refused the order. Sorrel's expression did not change, but she was very still. She filed the initial report, Kalen continued, the one that ended up sealed. The report that described your decision as having saved 2,000 soldiers. He paused. She wasn't pleased about it at the time, but she filed an accurate report. She filed it, Sorrel said carefully, and it was sealed. Yes, but she filed it accurately. He held her gaze. That's the distinction. A silence. You are suggesting, Sorrel said slowly, that I contact Admiral Vane directly. I'm suggesting that the one person on that panel who has direct knowledge that you make correct decisions under pressure, even when those decisions are inconvenient, is Admiral Sora Vane. He paused. And that a direct communication from you not filtered through the standard circuit, not reviewed by anyone in Dovek's chain, might carry weight that a document package takes longer to establish. She studied him. You want me to call someone who spent 8 months reviewing my conduct, she said, and ask her to trust my judgment. I want you to call someone who documented the truth about Voreth Crossing, even when it was uncomfortable, he said, and trust that she still cares about accurate documentation. A long silence. Tale looked at Sorrel. Sorrel looked at the wall panel. The orange light of the counter-challenge was still active. 35 minutes now, maybe less. She walked to the panel. Open an emergency direct line to Admiral Sora Vane, she said. Field Operations Emergency Panel Personal Channel. Tile worked the panel. 11 seconds. A connection tone, and then a voice. Older. Clear. The particular clarity of someone who has spent decades making sure they are heard precisely, not loudly, and knows the difference. Commander Sorrel. A pause. This is unexpected. Admiral Vane. Sorrel's voice was steady, not pleading, not apologetic. Steady in the way of someone who has decided to say the exact true thing and nothing else. I have filed an Article 14 submission against General Marin Dovek. The documentation has been transmitted to the panel through the emergency channel. It includes archive override records and a transfer authorization that demonstrate deliberate operational intelligence alteration over a minimum 72-hour period. A pause on the other end. I am aware of the filing, Admiral Vane said. I am also aware of the counter-challenge. The counter-challenge will claim the evidence is fabricated, Sorrel said. It is not. The documentation is real. The secondary array verification is real. The encirclement pattern it reveals is real and currently being addressed through fleet repositioning that Dovek's suspension made possible. She paused. If the counter-challenge succeeds before the panel reviews the documentation, the repositioning can be countermanded. The encirclement completes in 6 days. The Drevith front collapses. Another pause. Longer. You are asking me to delay the counter-challenge review, Admiral Vane said. I am asking you to review the documentation first, Sorrel said, in the sequence that reflects the actual timeline of events. A pause. I am asking you to look at what is actually there before you make a decision about what it means. The longest pause yet. Kalen became aware that he was holding his breath again. He let it out. Quietly. The documentation package, Admiral Vane said finally, will be reviewed before the counter-challenge is processed. A pause. That is the sequence the evidence warrants. Another pause. Commander Sorrel. Admiral. The Voreth Review Board sealed that record because the order you refused was issued by an officer who no longer serves in this military. Her voice was precise, controlled. I want you to know that the accuracy of the original report was not in question, only its convenience. A silence. I understand, Sorrel said. I hope you do, Admiral Vane said, because I intend to review this documentation very carefully, and if it shows what you say it shows, a pause, then the conversation about what has been allowed to operate inside this command structure is long overdue. The line closed. The room was quiet. Tyle looked at the panel, then at Sorrel. Counter-challenge processing is on hold pending documentation review. He paused. Dovek's codes stay frozen. Sorrel turned from this panel. She looked at the star map one more time, at the fleet symbols moving through the western corridor, at the encirclement pattern slowly losing its shape as the formations repositioned to where they needed to be. The repositioning holds, Callan said. Yes. The documentation reaches the panel. Yes. Dovek's challenge fails. Most likely, she paused. Admiral Vane is thorough. She will find what is in those files. Callan nodded. And then there wasn't anything immediately necessary to say, which was unusual for him. For most of the past 8 weeks, there had always been something immediately necessary to say or do or calculate or write in the notebook. The urgency had been constant, a background frequency he'd stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing a sound that never goes away. Now it was gone. The war outside was still moving. The fortress still vibrated with the engines of redirecting ships. Somewhere in the building, General Marin Dovek was sitting with frozen command codes and a counter-challenge that was not going to be processed in the order he'd expected. And in this room, this quiet room with its drifting star maps, and its 2 data slates sitting on the command table like documentation that certain things had been real all along. There wasn't anything immediately necessary. For the first time in 8 weeks, there wasn't. Tyle looked up from the secondary station. His expression was professional, the expression of a man who had been monitoring the repositioning updates diligently and had certainly not been listening to anything else. Repositioning on schedule, he said. Second Fleet Group through the Western Corridor in 14 hours. Encirclement window closes 17 hours after that. He checked his slate. Coalition leading formation will be intercepted in approximately 8 hours. And the documentation package, a pause, has been confirmed received by Admiral Vane's office. Counter-challenge processing remains on hold. Good, Sorrell said. Tyle looked at his wrist device. I should go coordinate the interception timing with the forward units. Directly. He was already moving toward the door with the focused purpose of a man who has somewhere specific to be. I'll be in the secondary operations room if you need me. The secondary operations room, Sorrell said. Which is? 4 corridors away, Tyle said without looking back. At minimum. The door closed behind him. At minimum. Callan filed that information away without comment. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when the urgency that defined them has resolved into something that doesn't have a category yet. Sorrell sat down on the edge of the command table, not in a chair, on the edge of the table itself, the same way she'd done in the middle of part 2, when the weight of what Callan had told her had been enough to make even the architecture of a command posture seem like too much to maintain. She put her hands flat on the surface beside her. She looked at the notebook. How many pages, she said. He picked it up, riffled through it. 43 front and back. 8 weeks of work. More or less, he paused. The first few pages are older, from before I understood the full pattern. Before Ashara. No, after Ashara. He looked at the cover. Before I understood how big it had gotten since then. She was quiet for a moment. I have been trying to understand, she said slowly, what it takes for someone to do this. Do what? This, she gestured. Not at the room exactly, but at everything the room represented. The battlefield outside, the files on the slates, the 43 pages of cramped handwriting, the 4 months of planning, the very long walk. To commit this much to something you have no official role in, no guaranteed outcome from, no protection if it goes wrong. He was quiet for a moment. I had a personal stake, he said. Ishara. I filed 2 reports, he said, both archived, and then I sat at my desk and looked at a casualty summary and thought about all the reports I'd filed. All the times I'd done the right procedural thing, submitted through the proper channel, used the correct format, included sufficient source documentation. He paused, and I thought about how much good it had done. She waited. So the question became, ta-dam, he said, what do you do when the right procedural thing has stopped working? He looked at the notebook. You either accept that some things can't be changed, or you find a different procedure. She looked at him. A different procedure, she said. I tried 3, he said. The 4th one involved an exploding munitions cache and a very long walk. Something happened in her face, the architecture of a smile, the shape that lives just before one in the moment when someone is deciding whether to let it be visible. She let it be visible, not the controlled near expression from earlier. Something warmer. Something that changed her face the way light changes a room when you open a window, not by adding something foreign, but by revealing what was already there. Kalen sat very still for a moment. Because he was human and she was Ilaran, and they were in a fortress on a contested planet with a war being quietly redirected around them. And she was smiling. At him. In the way that made it clear she wasn't thinking about the war right now. Which was. He was going to need a moment. Just a small one. He looked at the notebook instead. The recovery work, he said after a moment. It's what I do. After this, after the testimony. He paused. I was planning to go back to it. Were you, she said. It's real work, tangible. Equipment that's recovered and refurbished is equipment that doesn't need to be manufactured. Resources that go somewhere else. He paused. It's less dramatic than whatever this was, but it's not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing, she said. You made a face. I did not make a face. You made a face, he said. She looked at him steadily. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. The command structure has a problem, she said finally. You described it yourself. Dovek is one person. The system that allowed him to operate is a larger issue. Yes. Identifying that problem, documenting it, understanding how it functions and where its weaknesses are. She paused. That requires someone who understands the patterns. He was quiet. Someone who has been reading those patterns for 9 years, she said, and who knows how to document what he finds in a way that cannot be archived without review. He looked at the notebook in his hands. That sounds like a job description, he said. It might be. For whom? She looked at him. I don't have a civilian analyst position on record, she said carefully, because the First Wing has never carried civilian consultants. The position doesn't exist. She paused. I would have to create it. That sounds like paperwork, he said. Considerable paperwork. Administrative burden. Significant. You do that, he said. Not a challenge. Genuine question. I would do that, she said, if the right person was available to fill the role. He looked at her steadily. She looked at him steadily, and in the blue light of the corrected star map with the fortress vibrating softly around them as ships moved into new positions, with 43 pages of cramped handwriting on the table between them, and 2 data slates that had rewritten the architecture of this command structure. He thought about what he'd said when she first asked him what he wanted. He'd said you. He'd meant it more specifically than anyone in that room had understood at the time. Not the empire, not the position, not the resolution of the crisis, though that mattered more than almost anything. Her. The person who 8 months into a formal review process that could have ended her career had filed an accurate report under pressure. The person who had said no to a wrong order and not moved from that no. The person who had sat on the edge of a command table in full armor and looked tired for exactly as long as she needed to, and then stood back up. The person who had listened actually listened when it mattered. The person who had looked at a man with no weapons, no credentials, no official standing, and decided the information he carried was worth her attention. The paperwork, he said finally. Yes. Is there a standard form? Something in her expression shifted, warm and controlled and real all at once. I'll have Tael design one, she said. He'll make it very thorough. He makes everything very thorough. I noticed. She looked at him for a long moment. Stay, she said. Simple. Direct. The word of someone who has already made the decision and is just now saying it out loud. For the testimony, she added. The board review will take at minimum 10 days, probably longer. You'll be needed. I know, he said. And after that, she paused. There is work to do. Real work. The kind that doesn't go into archive systems without review. Her eyes held his. The kind that requires someone who knows what the pattern looks like before it becomes a casualty summary on somebody's desk. Kalen was quiet. He thought about the outer systems, about the recovery work, the tangible, visible results, the equipment that came back usable. He thought about a casualty summary and how long he'd sat looking at it. He thought about 3 failed attempts, about a name on a transfer order, about a comm line that went quiet and stayed quiet. He thought about 4 months of planning in one battlefield, in one munitions cache, in one very long walk into a room that smelled like burnt metal and old decisions. He thought about what changes when the right person finally listens. Okay, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Okay, I'll stay. For the testimony. And after. For the position. For, he paused. Yes, for the position. A silence. And for the paperwork, she said. I've filled out worse forms, he said. She looked at him. Something warm moved behind her eyes. I don't doubt it, she said. Outside, the ships were moving. The encirclement was failing piece by piece as the formations repositioned to where they actually needed to be. The Western Corridor was holding. The review board would convene. The documentation would be read. And somewhere in this fortress, a general was sitting in a room with frozen command codes, in the particular silence of someone who has watched a plan fail because one person refused to stay quiet. And in the war chamber that smelled like burnt metal and old decisions and something newer that didn't have a name yet, two people sat across from each other in the quiet that follows the kind of day that changes things. Sorrel looked at the star map one last time, at the corrected positions, at the shape of a trap that was no longer closing. Then she looked at the notebook on the table between them. Turn to a clean page, she said. Colin looked at her. The structural vulnerabilities in the command circuit, she said. You've been thinking about them. Yes. Then let's start there. He opened the notebook, turned to a clean page, and in the room where a war had been quietly redirected by a man with no weapons and a 43-page notebook, Kalen Rowe picked up his data stylus. And they began, because the encirclement had been stopped. But the pattern that built it was still out there. And some problems, once you've seen them clearly, you cannot unfind. Which meant the work was just beginning. Which meant staying was not a concession. It was the only thing that made sense. The kind that costs something. The kind you give anyway.